वेलकम टू द नेशन स्टेट डायलॉग सीरीज राष्ट्र राज्य संवाद श्रृंखला में आपका स्वागत है. 欢迎收看民族国家对话系列. I'm Dr. Geeta Kocher, moderator for today's discussion. Today it's a pleasure to have with us Professor Antoine Roth, and Professor Roth is an assistant professor at the Faculty of Law of Tohoku University in Sendai, Japan. His research focuses on international order in East Asia in a historical perspective, on regional diplomatic norms, and on the foreign policy of China and Japan. He has published a lot of works on the transformation of regional order and on the role of ritual foreign policy and regional diplomacy. Welcome, Professor Roth, to our discussion.
Hi, thank you for having me.
Okay, so let me begin by, asking you about your work, that is the hierarchical vision of order. It looks at China's foreign policy and international order in Asia. So can you give some insights as to how you see China's world vision evolving and how President Xi Jinping is reshaping policies to align with it?
Okay, so the basic argument of the book is that China has this hierarchical vision of order that, in a sense, assigns different roles to small and big power in order to maintain international stability. And each of these roles, the roles of big powers and the role of small powers, comes with differentiated expectations about which norms of behavior those powers should follow. And so for big powers, so obviously China first and foremost, but China also include the United States in there. I would say Russia, Japan, India. It depends, on time and context, but usually those are the ones included. So those should maintain stable relations with each other, and with regard to smaller powers, should share the fruits of economic growth. Behave in a sort of a benevolent way and be, like help them prosper as well. Whereas the role for small powers, the norms that they should respect is to show respect to big powers. That means support their initiatives when big powers promote international initiatives, and respect the big powers' red lines. So obviously for China, this is very important because for its expectation for smaller powers that it respects its major red lines, namely like the territorial issues, of course Taiwan first and foremost, but also those in the South China Sea and elsewhere, and also refrain from commenting on internal affairs, and simply demonstrates a certain amount of respect to China in their international behavior. And I would say that where Xi Jinping has been most proactive, previous leaders in advancing this vision, is to translate this kind of understanding of different expectations between small and big powers in the actual pattern of diplomatic activity, which under Xi Jinping has been very Sinocentric. So China has created all these forums centered on itself with other region, China plus X region with Latin America, of course, with ASEAN, with Southeast Asia. It was already in place much before Xi Jinping came to power, but also with South Asian countries, with Central Asian one, and so on. And I should say that even more so now, Xi Jinping really. So he expects other leaders to come to him, to China, to demonstrate that China is de facto the center of diplomatic activity in Asia and increasingly more broadly around the world. And those Sinocentric forums that China has put in place, first, very demonstratively, China's a very important role in the international stage, China's leading role in international affairs, and they also promote China's discourse about international affairs, that China is a benevolent power that only seeks win-win cooperation with other states, and criticism of the United States and other European powers, Western powers, as being more exploitative and not respecting the rights of other states. So all this Chinese discourse is promoted very consistently through those forums, and also those forums give China agenda setting power, so it can decide which topics are under discussions. It can try to push the cooperation in certain directions that advance its ideas. Of course, it's still a collaborative process. I'm not saying that China decides everything in those forums, but it has, obviously the stronger voice, and it can also control the pace and manner of engagement. Those frameworks are usually very allow China to essentially adapt them to its current circumstances and to the need of its foreign policy. And another thing that is quite significant about Xi Jinping's approach to international order is that he's really not shy about using all the tools of that China has at its disposal with its great economic and military rise to make sure that other states behave in a way in accordance with the expectation and embrace the role that China is assigning to them. So that means it's using discourse power, that is the power to define what good international behavior, so to speak, means. It is not shy in using its military power to all other countries, demonstrate its might and try to dissuade them from challenging it in any way. And also it is using the fruits of its economic growth to distribute other benefits, economic benefits to other states and ensure that they in return conform with the roles that is expected of them.
So are you saying this hierarchical, structure is somewhat similar to the older Tianxia system?
Well, so I wouldn't draw. It's true that in my book I do talk about historical continuities between, the imperial period and current days, but I wouldn't draw too direct a line. I would say that you do have similar certain ideals that originate in Chinese traditional political philosophy that do still are relevant today. The connection between order in one hand, order requires each state to understand its proper place in the international system in order to maintain stability, these kind of things, and the moralizing discourse that China usually employs about international relations, about China is benevolent power and the US and Western states are not, this kind of moral comparison that China often uses. These are consistent with traditional political philosophy. But I should also mention that the international system has changed greatly from imperial system to today, and China is not trying to return to the past in this kind of straightforward way. It is fully adapted to the current international system and its emphasis on sovereignty, on the legal equality of states, on the respect for international borders. Although, of course, for China, that doesn't include the borders where it itself has a dispute with other states. So, I don't want to draw too close a line between past and present. But I would say what you see consistently this demonstrate to show very through these international forums, these Sino-centric forums that I mentioned, how China is the leading power in Asia and is the one kind of determining the international agenda, driving the pace of diplomatic engagement and so on. So this desire to show China as the center of international life, that is something that is quite consistent over the course of China's history from imperial times. But again, the word has changed greatly, and saying simply that China wants to return to the tribute system or this kind of simple narratives that you hear often, I think needs to be taken with care and understanding again that the world has changed greatly and that China has adapted to this change very pragmatically.
Okay, I mean, let me push you to Japan, because in recent years we see frictions between China and Japan have multiplied, especially with China's emphasis on the century of humiliation or Victory Day parade, etc., all of these things. So what are the causes of this heightened tensions, and where would lead the future of Asia, in your opinion?
So I would say the most immediate source of tension between China and Japan in recent years have been security issues in the East China Sea. Of course, in the early 2010s, it was on the Senkaku Islands that China calls the Diaoyu Islands that is disputed between the two countries. And more recently, as the major flashpoint between the two states. I think we will talk about Taiwan a bit later, but I should say that behind these security tensions today, just like there was behind the tensions around, I would say, really driving Sino-Japanese tensions in the 1990s and 2000s, you do have, I think, a deeper disagreement about the respective status of the two states and their role in international order. Going back to my argument of my book about China's expectation for order, I would say that China now really claims the status of center of Asia, of protection and the kind of victory parade that it conducts regularly on the anniversary of the end of World War II, for instance, is a means for China to claim legitimacy for its role as a upholder and protector of international order, saying that it is part of the victors that define the international order post World War II, and of course Japan being on the other losing side should then know its place. So because China's message to Japan is that, as Xi Jinping often said, the East is rising, the West is falling, is in decline, and Japan should accept that its traditional protector, United States, is slowly fading away, and Japan should accept that China is now the natural center of Asia and accept a kind of a secondary status in this Asian order, which obviously Japan is very determined not to accept. It refuses this kind of a Chinese claim to superiority and to being the center of East Asian order, and Japan keeps doubling down instead on its alignment with the US, on its support for US presence in East Asia, and for the so-called liberal international order. Even though the US itself doesn't seem to believe in it anymore, Japan still tries to hold on to it, I would say. And I think this kind of deeper disagreement on mutual status and on the vision for international order is behind the security tensions that you see today. For instance, the Senkaku Diaoyu Islands for Japan is a symbol of, well, if you let China gets those islands by force, that means that you let China destroy the so-called rules-based international order and establish its own Sino-centric order instead. So that's why it's so important for Japan to resist Chinese pressure there. That's the kind of mentality, I think, in Japan. And I would say that means that since Japan is now really the strongest anchor for the US presence in East Asia, and the one that is most determined to keep this presence strong, of course, you have the Philippines and South Korea as well, who are important allies, and Australia. But the Philippines is a smaller state, or South Korea is more closer to China and is not as powerful as Japan. So really, Japan is the major anchor for the US in East Asia, and that means that the US-China competition that you see at the global level in East Asia really goes through this this China-Japan competition. So that now this relation between China and Japan is kind of the major fault line in this greater confrontation, and that means that Japan is indeed biggest blockage for China to consolidate kind of a central position in East Asia. But even though Japan has not been able to doesn't have the means, doesn't have the power to fully compete with China on an equal basis, of course. And the US itself has been less and less cooperative in Japan's own efforts to maintain US centric order in East Asia. So that means that Japan has not been very successful in preventing China from occupying more and more of the space. But nevertheless, this kind of China-Japan tensions have a broader meaning in that sense for the order in East Asia and Asia at large.
So I'm just going from your point about how Japan is being told by China not to be the ally of US and East is rising and all of that. With Trump's visit to China, do you see any impact on Japan, especially considering Japan is an ally of the US and China's broad understanding with the US hampers Japan's own interest in the region? So how do you place that thing into context?
So I would say there are two very contradictory aspects to US policy towards Asia at the moment, because at the military level and at the functional cooperation level, the Pentagon remains committed to try to check China around the so-called First Island chain, and it is moving military assets in the region, missiles and so on. And actually, in some way, the Trump administration has been even more proactive, assertive in these efforts. And on the functional level, in the day-to-day alliance cooperation, things still seem to run quite smoothly between Japan and US, which is very reassuring for Japan. But on the political level, that's a very different picture altogether, because simply, Trump himself seems to be to see Xi Jinping as his only peer, along with Vladimir Putin, I guess, but really, and has been consistently backed down in face of Chinese pushback towards US pressure, and he has shown a sort of cowardice towards China that, of course, course, gives very little confidence in the US ability to, come to defense of its ally in case of confrontation, or really maintaining deterrence in East Asia, because that's the big problem for Japan. What Japan expects from the US, first and foremost, is to maintain through the US-Japan alliance the deterrence poster against China in East Asia. And again, of course, the US military remains the most formidable military in the planet, and it again is still seems seemingly committed to deterrence around the first island chain, and the US national defense strategy says as much. But of course, deterrence requires credibility, political credibility. That means a signal that, well, if there is indeed a crisis, you will respect your obligations to your allies and you will intervene. And on that front, I don't think anyone can say that Donald Trump is a reliable ally in any way. He himself is very erratic. The US administration today is a sort of personality cult where what the leader says goes. And if the leader says, well, I prefer, I don't care about Japan, I don't want to come to Japan's defense, then that's that. And everyone knows that now. It's very clear in the way the US government operates. So that's really undermines deterrence. And of course, the war against Iran has been a disaster on that front as well, because the US has demonstrated to the rest of the world that despite its overwhelming firepower, it has not been able to make Iran access to US demands. Instead, Iran seems to have emerged victorious from this confrontation. And so if Iran manages to hold its own against the US, despite the very strong power differential, so what chance does the US have against China? And also the US stocks have been greatly diminished. Everyone knows it. Like you have seen that the US has moved kit out of Asia in order to try to protect its ally in the Middle East. So this is of course not good for deterrence either. And since the Iran, again, with its much lesser capabilities than China, has been able to basically destroy make all US bases, land bases in the Gulf inoperable. Again, how vulnerable do you think are US bases in East Asia? And it would be foolish not to expect those bases to be rendered inoperable quite quickly in a conflict as well. And that is a very major concern for Japan, because again, the deterrent effect of US presence in the first island chain has been greatly weakened by the Trump administration, and even more recently by this war in Iran. And that this is now a major concern for Japan in its own relation with China.
Yeah. So when you're talking about this, conflict in the region, and specifically, the Taiwan issue that is significant for all these three parties, whether US, China, or Japan, how do you see the Taiwan issue in China-Japan relations, and what impact it can have on Asia in an overall sense, as to say?
So, as I already mentioned, Taiwan is now the greatest source of tension between China and Japan. It is not a completely new phenomenon. I would say you could trace it back all the way perhaps to 2020, where it really emerged as the main driver of tension between the two states. When the Biden administration in the US initially had a very assertive posture against China, and Biden himself several times said, well, of course the US would defend Taiwan in case of conflict, even though that's not US policy. So Japan itself, in Japan as well, Abe Shinzo, once he left power, also made several times remarks about how important Taiwan is to to Japanese security. And this really became you had more and more of discourse in Japan of alarm at the deterioration of the balance of power in the Taiwan Strait, and of Taiwan's the Taiwan situation in general, if your objective is to support autonomous Taiwan. So this has been a major driver of attention for some years now. But now I'm sure your audience is aware of the latest spat that started last autumn, when Takaichi Sanae, the Japanese Prime Minister, made a remark in the Diet saying that, well, a contingency over Taiwan would be a security threatening, like a national security threatening situation for Japan, and opening the way, saying like, well, plausibly Japan would intervene. So after that, you have had a really complete breakdown in Sino-Japanese relation. It is a genuine crisis, and I don't really see how you can move forward from this at the moment, because China expects some sort of gesture of amend or apology from the Takaichi government, and of course Takaichi herself seems very unlikely to give such an apology. That means that what Japan and China have been able to do until now, even after the deterioration of the dispute around the Senkaku or Diaoyu Islands, is to try to compartmentalize, to dance around the issue of the security dispute and say, well, we can still have some dialogue over, economic cooperation, over cooperation about development in East Asia, economic development in East Asia, and have some sort of dialogue, like steady and stable diplomatic dialogue. This seems very unlikely to happen anytime soon at the moment, which means that the first consequence of Asia for Asia of like downward from downstream from the dispute over Taiwan is that having some sort of Sino-Japanese cooperation over economic integration in Asia, like further a trade liberalization agenda, for instance, seem unlikely at the moment, and you see have more competitive dynamics where China is accusing Japan to be a new militarist power and trying to tell any country that wants to hear it that, well, Japan is now a new threat to international order. Of course, this message has very few takers, but that really it has been the Chinese stance. On the other hand, Japan is promoting an agenda of so-called collective autonomy, implying autonomy against Chinese pressure. It is promoting diversification of supply chains, economic security agenda. All this is driven by this kind of more intense competition between China and Japan. And of course, this kind of dispute between China and Japan has implications for the future of Taiwan itself, which is of great importance for the rest of Asia and, of course, for the world at large. Because if, God forbid, there is in fact a war over Taiwan, this would be a major economic catastrophe that would make the Iran war seems very small by comparison, I think. So, this has to be taken into account. And Japan has made over the last decade or more genuine moves to try to strengthen its defense of on the southern island chains, the Ryukyu Island around Okinawa and the islands south of that, and has moved a lot of military kit as well in that direction, and is making contingency planning in case there is a confrontation. So that is all meant to boost the credibility of Japan as a deterrent to conflict over Taiwan. And the Takaichi Sanai's remark in the Diet last year, it might have been clumsy, might have been a result of a lack of preparation from the prime minister to say it in this kind of improvised way, but the sentiment behind it is, I think, something that the Japanese political class shares, that you need to be more demonstrative of your commitment to Taiwan if you want to be seen as a credible deterrent against China. But we come back to the earlier point I made, that at the end of the day, if there is in fact a conflict over Taiwan, the US would be the one is supposed to take charge of the pushing back against Chinese pressure. And again, the credibility of U.S. commitment, both militarily and politically, has been greatly undermined. And of course, that means that for Japan point of view, that implies grave choices as well. Because if the U.S. is not fully committed, what can Japan do by itself? It remains very unclear, and it's also unclear whether the Japanese public would be willing to bear the price of having a genuine confrontation with China, which would mean having missiles raining down on the head of Japanese citizens. Are they willing to suffer that? It's very unclear, and it wouldn't become clear unless we, again, God forbid, we do enter such a confrontation. That means that on current path, the trajectory for Taiwan is quite negative if your objective is to maintain Taiwanese autonomy, and because Chinese pressure is climbing, and Japan and its allies don't have a great response to this growing Chinese pressure.
I'll just add some more point out here. When you're talking about the conflict that is possible between China and Japan, do you see Japan going nuclear? I mean, at constitutional level, they have been saying that we would not be going nuclear at any point of time. Is there a possibility that in order to defend the possibilities that are likely in case of China-Taiwan conflict, Japan will nuclearize itself and in order to defend itself or whatever?
Yes, so this is, of course, this was a taboo for the longest time, and now it is not a taboo anymore. There are, it's still, very sensitive issues, and it's not discussed in a very open manner. But you do have more and more politicians making mention, like you reference to it, and it seems increasingly clear that essentially Japan's commitment to not being a nuclear state depend greatly on, how intense they see the threat from China, how much trust they have in the U.S. commitment to its security, including the nuclear umbrella. And the less this commitment becomes credible, and the more China is seen as an existential threat, the more Japan is likely to eventually decide that pursuing a nuclear weapon is the logical, like necessary for ensuring said security. So if again, like China succeeds in taking over Taiwan, that would very likely be a trigger for Japan to pursue very quickly a nuclear weapon. But even short of that, this is a debate that is only going to grow if the current trajectory continues.
Okay, let me push you a little broader in the Asian context. And when we talk about Asia, India is one thing nobody can ignore about, right? We need to talk about how India is playing a role in the Asia. So India, Japan have recently strengthened their defense ties. And do you think this will impact the regional matrix? And how would the Asian order reshape, if not the global order at least? In the sense, as you're saying, China is trying to be the main player in the Asia. So where do you put India in that context, and what changes might happen because of that?
Yes. So first, Japan's bet, so to speak, on India as a major security partner is long-standing. It was a precursor to other U.S. and U.S. aligned countries in seeing India as an important partner, and it comes all the way back to the early 2000s under the first Abe administration, and it has only Japan has never wavered in its desire for closer ties with India, and it's still today. Of course, Takaichi Sane was in India very recently and has again reaffirmed this commitment. So this commitment is genuine, and it includes a strong security component. One caveat there is, of course, when it comes to, of course, the major common threat that Japan and India face is, of course, China. But the challenge posed by China is very different for Japan and India, because for India it's primarily land-based, challenge in the Himalayas, in the disputed territories north of India, whereas for Japan, it is a maritime issue first and foremost. And of course, China now has the capacities to be a challenge for both countries simultaneously on both fronts. It does have this military capability. So that's a caveat. But without being said, India has also undergone a genuine maritime buildup, and that maritime buildup is very welcome in Tokyo. You have a growing agenda around cooperation around the security of sea lanes, military equipment and technology development, and so on. So, and this is only likely to continue to grow in the following years. And of course, even though China is not always explicitly mentioned as a driver, this is, of course, a major driver of this cooperation. But I would say that essentially, since India, in terms of the regional balance of power against Chinese maritime advances, India strengthening its maritime capabilities in the Indian Ocean, and Japan, in cooperation with the US, Philippines, and Australia, strengthening its kind of maritime capabilities in East Asia, in the Western Pacific. This is complementary. They can do that both on their own, on their own terms, for their own interest, for their own perspective, and this, they have a mutual interest in seeing the other do so. So there is really a lot of synergy there, and the India-Japan cooperation is kind of a bonus on that, and it makes this kind of cooperation more grounded in the capabilities that both of them are acquiring in their respective area. So of course, this is genuine development that is contributing to maintaining a balance of power that doesn't allow China to have a completely free hand in maritime Asia from the Indian Ocean, of course, to the Pacific Ocean. And I would say that this kind of balance of power logic is also it relies on a broader joint vision for international order that is, as a Japanese leader like to say, rules-based international order, that the vision of the free and open in the Indo-Pacific and so on, that has been there has been a lot of a discussion with India about this kind of shared vision for international order, and to the extent that it concerns Chinese China's growing presence throughout East Asia, its behavior in territorial disputes and so on. India and Japan are clearly on the same page, and they have this kind of joint commitment to preserve having an alternative balancing coalition through the Quad as well. But that doesn't mean that Japan and India are completely aligned, because again, Japan is completely committed to maintaining U.S. leadership in international affairs. It holds to this kind of U.S.-led international order, whereas India, as of course you well know, holds dear its strategic autonomy, doesn't want to be closely aligned to the U.S. It wants to be an independent actor in international states. It embraces a multipolar vision of international order, not one that is dominated by the West. That means there is, especially now that the US itself has turned very destructive toward international order, very domineering, and is alienating a lot of states, India first and foremost. This means that Japan-US-India cooperation itself on the issues of international order become more complicated as well, because the US itself is a much less reliable and attractive partner. So that does pose, of course, real limits, I would say, on Japan-India cooperation in this kind of broad international order context. But nevertheless, this is a very important partnership. This is only likely to grow, and the more India itself, grows in power, grows in maritime capabilities, that is fully welcomed by Japan, and reciprocally, like Japan building up its maritime capabilities and its international activism on the international stage. This is, there is broad alignment, I think, here on their objective.
So let me just ask you the last final thing about how, in your opinion, India and Japan reshape the balance of power without triggering a direct military conflict. I mean, of course, they want to be a part of the UNSC, both of them, but I mean, are there any other options that you see, and what can really change and contain China's aggressive posture in Asia?
Yes, so I would say first, what's important is to have an agenda, even in security terms, that goes beyond hard military security, goes to the provision of public goods and maritime law enforcement, so anti-piracy missions, these kind of things, and both bilaterally between Japan and India, sorry, and between Japan, India, and other members of the Quad. So this agenda exists. Both countries do talk about it quite regularly, and there is, joint law enforcement activity and these kind of things. So this is very welcome, and this is a way to give an agenda that is not necessarily directly targeted at China, that has a broader positive impact for all countries in the region. So that is, I think, of course, a genuine good thing that gives diversity and different dimensions to their cooperation. Of course, in the framework of the Quad now, with the U.S. administration being what it is very difficult to pursue such an agenda at the moment. And to be fair, even before the Trump administration, these kind of initiatives on public goods provision and so on were more declarative than substantive, but this is still the right path to go, I think, in that respect. Another important aspect, I think, would be to work together with Southeast Asian countries. Both India and Japan say they support ASEAN centrality in discussing international issues in the broader Indo-Pacific and in Asia writ large. And of course, this is something that they do generally agree on, and that Southeast Asian states welcome. That means that, of course, in this respect, avoiding any sort of anti-China rhetoric or any rhetoric that is solely focused on, again, hard security military issues is even more important, because the only way to have good cooperation with Southeast Asian states is to have a broader agenda that puts economy first and that goes beyond is kind of confrontational politics, because of course Southeast Asian states are very uninterested in this kind of confrontational politics. So that's very important, and I think there is much more to do for Japan, India in that respect. Especially India, has its Act East policy, but it has not been quite consistent, I would say, in following up on. And there is much more to do, I think, for India to engage Southeast Asia, and Japan would be more than more than willing to work with India in that respect. So I think that's also a way to avoid any purely geopolitical confrontational framework. And then finally, I would say that both states individually need some positive agenda with China, as well as just saying that we want to push back against Chinese maritime advances and overreach and territorial ambitions. So Abe Shinzo, used to understand that when in the 2010s when he was prime minister, because he did try to reestablish good relation with China. It expressed support for the Belt and Road Initiative, these kind of things that allowed for Japan to have not only this kind of confrontational agenda with China, and that was very important to avoid, overall deterioration of relations. And I don't think that Takaichi Sane is interested in that at the moment, and I think that's a big flaw in her policy. She would need again to have both sides of the equation in order to have a compressive China policy. I think on the Indian side, Modi, the prime minister, also understands that, and he is seeking to have a stable relation with China and to have an economic agenda as well. I think again that's important if you want to avoid a purely confrontational mindset. So I think on that at the moment the problem is more on the Japanese side than on the Indian side in that respect.
Oh, very well said. Thank you very much. I mean, I am really appreciating so many things which our audience in India may not be knowing about Japan and their perspective. Thank you for giving those insights, Professor Roth. And I think we can continue our discussions more in future. For our audience, I hope you like this discussion and you would continue to like and subscribe our channel. Please keep watching. We'll have many more such interesting videos and academic discussions. Thank you very much. Namaskar.